You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
Land records in all its three forms, textual, spatial, and transactional, are either flawed or non-existent for large parts of India's hinterlands. This has far-reaching implications, from curtailing people's access to formal credit systems to complicating property-related disputes. To address these limitations, Prime Minister Narendra Modi on April 24, 2020, which is the National Panchayati Raj Day, launched the SVAMITVA scheme, or the Survey of Villages and Mapping with Improvised Technology in Village Areas. This scheme, which falls under the Ministry of Panchayati Raj, seeks to update land records of Abadi areas through drone-based surveys and provide residents with property cards or record of rights. On October 11th, about 6 months after the scheme's official launch, PM Modi distributed cards to over 1 lakh rural property holders from 763 villages. The scheme aims to cover approximately 6.62 lakh villages across India over a period of 4 years. Given the SVAMITVA scheme's ambitious scope and its potential in helping millions of rural inhabitants gain access to secure property rights, we are thrilled to have a close look at the scheme on our episode today. Welcome to the Quint's fortnightly podcast, Land of a Billion. This podcast is produced in association with the Property Rights Research Consortium, or PRRC, which is supported by Omidya Network India, an investment firm focused on social impact. PRRC is a network of leading think tanks and research organizations working to collaborate and drive policy action in the field of land, housing, and property rights in India. Today, we will be speaking to someone who has been instrumental in propelling the SVAMITVA scheme forward, Mr. A P Nagar, who is Joint Secretary at the Ministry of Panchayati Raj. Thank you for joining us. We're very happy to have you on the show.
Thank you, Abhishek.
So the goal of our podcast is to understand what it takes to secure land rights for a billion. I'd like to start by discussing the impetus behind the SVAMITVA scheme in this context.
You're aware that while the delimitation of agricultural lands has been going on forever, there wasn't anything much in them from the standpoint of recovering revenues. So in successive settlements, whether it be in the Mughals or the British times, Abadi was something that was pretty much left to itself. In fact, the term Lal Dora, so Lal Dora, it denotes that beyond the Lal Dora, we are not concerned what's happening there. And this is the place where people are actually living.
Yes, and just to make this distinction between Abadi and agricultural land clear for our listeners, agricultural land refers to land reserved for agricultural and livestock rearing purposes, and it can't be used for any other sort of activity, whereas Abadi land refers to non-agricultural land in rural areas which are mostly used for residential purposes. In India, while records have been maintained for agricultural land, as Mr. Nagar mentioned, no such records exist for Abadi land. And that's where the SVAMITVA scheme comes in. Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Nagar.
So there are umpteen conflicts that I have personally heard about in my family, in my friends' family, something that they've experienced, that there are generations that don't talk to each other because there are no fixed property papers. So this thing is set to change all that. People would have a document telling everyone that this is the extent of the ownership, these are the owners. If the land is encumbered, it would be indicated, and so on.
And how exactly does the scheme plan to change this? We know that almost 2 in every 3 civil legal cases are related to disputes over land. So there's clearly an urgent need to fairly resolve disputes.
The first thing that they do in a village when you start out with this process is that you draw a limestone, a chuna line. And that chula line itself is a process of sinking your differences or bringing your differences to the fore, really, in front of the village headman, the panch, the ward members, the government machinery, the police, and all that. And so people have claims and counterclaims, and there are oral references or oral evidences that so-and-so said so-and-so, and people bring it to a conclusion because there's nobody who wants it not to happen. So that process in itself brings about a certain amount of reconciliation. And if I could call it the last nail in the coffin, comes when the maps that have been prepared are put in the public domain for the purpose of eliciting objections, if any. And once that is done, it pretty much brings the thing to an end. Again, the experience, what I was told in Maharashtra is that 99% of the cases, just sail through. And there is only about 1% of the cases where the differences are irreconcilable and people have to resort to litigation. They escalate it to any number of courts and all that.
But help me to understand this, Mr. Nagar. If the scheme aims to hand out property cards, then why is it under the domain of the Ministry of Panchayati Raj as opposed to the Department of Land Resources? What role do panchayats play here?
So Panchayat Raj institutions, we stepped in because this was a proposal that to begin with came to us from the government of Maharashtra, really, who had started this thing, and they needed to fill in this gap of the drone survey. This technology existed. They had tested it in a few places, and that's how we got to start thinking about it, and it got developed further, and this is where we are at present. So we are in this because the Department of Land Resources says that they're not concerned with non-agricultural lands. And so it became our domain, especially because what we saw in Maharashtra to begin with, where they have a very good system of recovering property tax from the people living inside their villages, which comes out to be very substantial. In Panchayat Raj Ministry, we're constantly trying for panchayats to increase their own source of revenue so that they can really be the self-sufficient units that they were dreamed to be and they were conceived as. But that's not happened. If the papers are very clear, it's a subject that's devolved onto the panchayats. And if a state has actuated their mechanisms so that the panchayats can actually recover this tax, what we saw in Maharashtra was that the panchayats had a very transparent document to assess their taxes on. And so they could invest in a machinery that would ensure the collection of those taxes. It was a tax that nobody minded paying because it's not like the money was being accumulated far, far away in a central or a state kitty and then it would flow back to them. This was available to them within the panchayat. And so they could plan for those resources. They could deploy those resources as people felt. And one saw the perceptible change or improvement. Lights work and drains don't choke, and things that have to be fixed get fixed immediately. So that's in it for panchayat. So that's not something that we can bring about by ourselves. We are very carefully aware that panchayats are a state subject and the states would want to do with it what they feel fit, what their people want them to do. But really, we've set the stage. So such a thing exists now.
So from a rural planning standpoint, this would help build financial resilience at the local level.
Also, from the standpoint of planning your assets, the villages are typically unplanned entities because they just grew organically. In cities, one's expectation is that the assets are going to be very well planned, that there are going to be green spaces, there's going to be commercial spaces, there's going to be recreation, and so on and so forth. One doesn't expect this of these villages. Why? Because there is no space really. They're cloistered inside that Lal Dora, and they don't know how to cross that. Of course, people cross it all the times, but then they're going into agricultural land and the mechanism does not exist for a land use change and so on. So this would also give the Gram Panchayats, the state government, a basis for bringing about a transformation, really. If you want the areas next to the highways to be the commercial areas, if you want the living spaces to be a little offset from the highways, or if you want your green spaces to be close to the natural water bodies, that is all that this can provide you the means for.
Yes, spatial maps can definitely aid panchayats in their planning and zoning needs. In terms of finances again, so the scheme is set to improve access to credit for people who hold property cards. However, India lags far behind other countries in using land as collateral. Will SVAMITVA change the scenario?
See, just because one has a property card or a sanad or an adhikar, a vilek, does not mean they go running to the bank, right? People in our country have very clear ideas about how important land is to their existence. And it is normally, where I come from, it is like a last resort. If you're going to mortgage your residential assets, I'm told it's not like that in a lot of the developed world. But here it is considered a very last resort sort of a thing. So Swamitva, the property papers at least gives a person an opportunity. The Honorable Prime Minister, when he set off the distribution of the property cards across 763 villages on the 11th of October, so he also interacted with a few people, and that was really an eye opener. There was a range of people who interacted. At one end of the spectrum, you had a widow called Ramrati, who sells vegetables, who makes samosas. She was widowed early and she brought her children up, who are all grown up now. So she was happy to share that she's been able to obtain approval for a loan of 20,000 rupees against her Abadi land property, because that's what she needed and that was something that she could readily pay off. At the other end of the spectrum, you had a guy living close to Gurgaon who has a 400 square meter or 400 square yard plot. This guy was getting a loan of 15 lakhs and he could very well pay for it and he seemed rather well off. In the middle, you had a guy who's a Raj Mistri, who's a mason, who makes about 15,000 bucks every month. And this guy has been able to obtain a loan of 3 lakhs to invest in some inputs that he needs to build a separate room and so on. So if you want it and if you are ready to shell out some of the money from your earnings, then this provides you an additional opportunity.
So yes, using the property card as collateral is one among the many ways people can use their land. So the scheme aims to cover 6.62 lakh villages by 2024. And in other interviews, you've spoken about the enthusiastic response you've received from several states to increase coverage. Could you walk me through the different phases of the program in achieving the goal that we mentioned?
So to begin with, of course, Survey of India had to be onboarded. Survey of India were very enthusiastic about it from the very beginning, because this hybrid of technology and human inputs, it costs about 1/10 of the survey costs that one normally incurred in the regular total station kind of a survey when one went about from one place to the another with a flagstaff and all that. So Survey of India were there, and one thing that they need to reference, they need to locate a position very clearly on the ground. They have ground control points. So there is a system called continuous operating referencing system, which is like a public good, just as you have mobile towers everywhere to give you better connectivity. So if one has a good network of CORS stations across the country, then it is very easy to locate yourself very accurately on a certain point, on any given point in that area. So you need a CORS station every 50, 60 kilometers or something. And once you have that, then things become much easier. Otherwise, locating yourself is a pretty laborious exercise in itself. So Survey of India said that they already had the CORS system in a number of states, and they were in the process of establishing it. They have some resources of their own, some project through which they were already in the process of doing that. And we went with the states where the CORS was either already established or in the process of being established, so that our drone survey would become much easier and very accurate in its conduct and in its ability to locate the parcels of land. So, which is why the initial number of states that we went with, that decision was mainly guided by the CORS network that already exists. Till date, you'd be surprised to know that the Ministry of Panchayati Raj has not really paid anybody anything, because the money had to come through this process, which has only become possible now. So that was the kind of enthusiasm and the good faith in which everybody worked. Survey of India, most of all, they had to invest in drones, they had to invest in training, they had to invest in the movement of their cadres from one state to the other, their trained personnel. The states, of course, it was extremely important, their enthusiasm, because until this is the state subject, and until the states provided for Swamitva under their legislation. So this was another interesting thing, Abhishek. I will digress a bit.
Yes, go ahead.
In Haryana, they made amendments, or they used the provisions of the Haryana Panchayat Raj Act. There's a section that says the administration of the Abadi land is going to be the responsibility of the Panchayat. So they took off from there. And the paper that they are giving to the rural residents in Haryana is called a title deed. So which is like a regular deed And it's a registered deed, and Haryana government has said that the first registration is going to be gratis. So people get it free in the beginning, but for subsequent transactions, the registration fee has to be paid like it has to be done for any other property in the cities. All other states made adjustments to their Land Revenue Code or their Land Revenue Act. So they had to do this very quickly. And we have this diversity of names, of the provisions that have been invoked for according this status to the Swamitva deed. In UP, they call it Gharoni. So Gharoni takes after Khatoni. So Khet is your agricultural field. Khatoni is the paper corresponding to that. So analogous to that, they called this thing Gharoni. There were Uttarakhand who called this Swamitva Vilek.
That's interesting to know. So, given these differences, did the Ministry of Panchayati Raj see any scope in facilitating cross-learning between states?
It was such an interesting thing to see states learn from each other. So, UP picked up a lot of its things from Karnataka. Of course, UP and Uttarakhand are very similar to all that. So, in Madhya Pradesh, they also learned from what everybody else is doing, but then they went a step further and they put together a framework for this all by themselves. In which they spelled out their priorities. They rolled out a very good information and education campaign. In Uttar Pradesh, they painted their panchayat walls with information about Swamitva because it was very important that the scheme not be waylaid by some vicious propaganda or something that what is it that the government is trying to do. So it was really heartwarming, this whole thing, and it is what kept us going throughout. And Survey of India had to seriously multiply their resources manyfold. Because to begin with, they were just doing it in Maharashtra, and all of a sudden, the requirement of drone teams was 10 times what it had been till now. So we reached out to the Ministry of Civil Aviation, and everybody helped. Everybody helped out of their way. Whatever they could do, people came forth. They intervened even where it was not proper to do it, but everyone helped us. So flying permissions were secured, procurements were brought on track. There is something that the Survey of India is trying to do, that they're creating this ecosystem now, that rather than create this big inventory of drones, and why can't they have people buy this on themselves, and why don't they rent it from the people for the purpose of this project, and so that they don't have an inventory and they don't have to look after this forever. So not only that, with each drone, there would be the requirement of a pilot and a co-pilot. And if those permissions come through, to engage these private players, we would have opened a whole new avenue of jobs, of business. Things just grew by themselves.
And were there any challenges as well? If so, what did they look like?
We were thick into the monsoons in Karnataka, where we ended up doing just distributing the RPOR deeds of only 2 villages. Karnataka, we expected much more, but the winds were very high. And there were drone teams that would go there and just sit there for days together. Tuna lines have to be drawn. So tuna lines would get washed out in the rains, and the next day they had to come and do it again. People improvised. People, the old audio cassette tape. So some of the people used that. Rather than have tuna lines, they would drive nails into the ground and a little high above the ground, and then they would tie this tape from one place to the other. And the tape would show very well in the drone images. People used paint, and there were things that just happened,
Yes, definitely. And it's heartening to hear about the creative responses people had to challenges. And I'm glad we've covered some of the phases of the scheme so far. I wanted to know about what the next 4 years might look like.
We have already been written to by some of the states. For instance, Andhra and Chhattisgarh. Of course, Punjab, we are already doing the CORS network there. So Punjab had very early on said that, why don't you fly your drones here also? So there are these 4 or 5 candidates who are already lined up. In the framework that we had formulated for the pilot scheme, we had a year-wise phasing right up to the year 2024. The basis was, again, how quickly would the CORS station be established a little ahead of the implementation of Swamitva so that the benefits could be reaped by the Swamitva scheme. So, by way of an example, I'll tell you that I think Telangana or Andhra were scheduled in the penultimate year, 23-24, I think, in the last year of the scheme. And they saw that. So we have circulated the framework among all the states that this is going to come to you sooner or later. So you may as well also get your act together. They've written to the minister that, why don't you advance us? I mean, we are pretty set in this. We've spread the word. People are ready. We have some technological infrastructure already in place. We formulated or we've completed the list of the people living inside villages. So why don't you bring us on in the current year rather than have us wait right till the last year of the project? And similar messages have also come from the state of Chhattisgarh and several other places. So it gives you the conviction really that you're onto something good. And if you see our framework for SVAMITVA scheme, which is there on our website, so the plan is to have 2.5 times this villages. So if you're doing 1 lakh this year, next year we peak and have two and a half for the next 2 years. And then in the last year, we would just be tapering off. We would be trying to get the systems in place.
So your team will be ramping things up in the coming months. And it must be quite encouraging that several of the states are eagerly looking forward and trying to get ahead of the timeline. So just switching gears a bit, could we focus on some of the factors that were considered while deliberating over the property card format and villages to be covered across the different states?
That was entirely the state's decision, actually, which villages are going to be covered. So when you're doing this in a state, and if it is something that others are going to watch jealously, then it's a good policy to not start from one end and slowly grow up to the other. You need to start all at once so that no area or no district feels deprived and the thing can be brought to a conclusion completely. So, in the phasing that was done, some of the states that were already doing it, we were looking to complete their drone survey completely, which would be Maharashtra and Haryana in our case. And the rest of the states, we targeted at completing them to the extent of 50%.
Right. And could you take me through what this process looked like on the ground?
Typically, there is this Abadi area that have been identified. It will be very good if two, three, four villages close by have all been Chuna marked. And once this is done, and Survey of India is told on the previous day that these villages are now ready, and they chart out a course on their computer or whatever their tablet devices. And the next morning, when they fly the drone, this thing flies, and while you're still chit chatting to them about what the drone does and what a wonderful device it is, the drone flies right back. So in about 16 minutes, it's completed two villages. And then you disassemble it and put it back in your car, and you travel to the next site and you assemble it and fly it again. And you've done another two villages. It is mind boggling for somebody. I'm an engineering person. I am also a forest service person, so I trained a lot for forest survey and all that. You would go breaking your back and carrying chains and stuff from one place to another. And this thing just finishes it off in no time at all. And then when the images come, people pour in over the shoulder of the Survey of India guys to see what their house looks like. Pretty much like Google Earth, you all try to spot your house looking at that map. So people are really curious, and yes.
I remember doing that as well. So should we revisit that question about the property card format in case there were other aspects that states deliberated upon?
So in all places except Haryana, the roots were in the revenue code and the revenue department. They have taken the template, I think, of the Jamabandi and the Khatoni that used to be there, and they have brought it together. To that, then they have tried to make some changes. There is also a little map that shows the area, what it looks like, where are the boundaries. The Khatoni that I have seen is just the map, and the Jamabandi is just the document which tells you that who are the owners and what is the area of land. So this is like a hybrid. It has a Khatoni and the Jamabandi both together. And financial institutions also want this. We knew without having to go to a bank first to ask them. They also want to know right away if the property is encumbered or not. So there has to be that provision for indicating the nature of encumberment and all that, whether or not it is encumbered if the person has taken a loan. That was our main consideration. Of course, Haryana, who have a title deed, have also put all these documents there. And maybe later on, if we get talking about the features that have to be extracted about government lands and all, at that point, I could tell you that Haryana has also tried to build in other layers, from the standpoint of who's occupying those houses. So people who are aged and who are widowed and who are beneficiaries of a certain scheme and who need certain kinds of inputs and all.
Yes, that's important. Let's discuss that now.
So there is a process called feature extraction in which the features that are requested by the state, again, this is something that varies from state to state. I can't emphasize this thing more than I've already done, that this is a state thing, and they need to organize it in the way that they consider best. And so the states have to identify the features that have to be extracted. So typically these would be the land parcels, the roads, the water bodies, the hand pumps, the streets and public lands, panchayat lands, and so on. There are some states with as many as 30 features that have been identified. And so after the maps have been prepared on the computers, they have to extract all these features. So the tuna lines that show a certain house, one needs to check, of course, back with the village if your house is the same boundaries as has been shown here. Of course, I mean, there is a 1-1 correspondence between this parcel and the owner of this land. And likewise, all government assets are also very clearly defined. So not only are the people benefiting, but the common lands that are close to villages, which could be the gobar dump or the traditional water bodies that are drying up and that are among the easiest to encroach really. So all these things are also getting marked on the maps.
That's a lot of detailed information. Is there a way that these property cards can be updated?
Now, the updates of these maps are not something that one has to, do. They don't have to get a drone again, and they don't have to do the classical survey chain compass or even, the total station thing. They just need to walk with a rover, which is like a GPS, and they have to first locate themselves. And wherever there have been new boundaries that have been created, so they just need to use the rover to define those boundaries on that land. They come back and feed that information on their computer, and the map is updated. Now, the states need to decide what is going to be the frequency of this thing, how the personnel are going to be trained for this, what would be the repository of this information, who would be the competent authority to sign that or to issue that, and so on. So all these things that are also very much needed to be firmly in position for the scheme to really realize its objective.
And what are the verification mechanisms put in place to ensure that the states are capturing accurate land ownership records? Does it recognize village commons or customary titles that do not have a written record, such as those held by indigenous people?
So because all these people are there in it together, which includes the revenue officials, the panchayat elected representatives, the Panchayat Raj officers, in some cases also the police, who have to be all there together. So the first part of this transparency things comes at the time of the tuna marking. Of course, it could be somebody's case that enough publicity was not accorded to the event. There wasn't sufficient notice, which is why some people failed to turn up. The endeavor is, of course, that everybody is there for that process. Normally, the notice is published several days ahead of the drone flying. It is there in the panchayat office. It is also announced everywhere. If the panchayat has got a website of their own, then typically it is something that is there. And most of all, people find out, people who are in touch with their villages, they find out through chats and phone calls and all that this thing is going to happen. So the people, the landowners on both sides of a boundary are there, the government is there, the panchayat representatives are there. So that is the first step of the diligence, that the tuna marking is marked as per everybody's consensus. If there are some silent dissenters, of course, they can come back and scuttle the process later on. I'm sure there are such people like that. But from the standpoint of the system, the plan that has been laid out, this is the first step in the diligence. The next step would be that once these property parcels have been marked out on a map, then in Uttar Pradesh, for instance, people are issued individual notices. So if there are 150 households, one would expect that everybody would get a little map showing them their property on which they are currently occupying. At the time of marking, for instance, if two polygons have been marked on the ground, which should have actually been one from the point of view of ownership, that is something that people take care of. They tell in response to those individual notices that have been issued that no, this line is incorrect and you should have this as one, and vice versa. If it has all been said as one, then the brothers would come and say that we've already partitioned this, so you cut a line through this. So this is the second step. And the final step is after the ground truthing has been done and the final maps have been prepared, then there is a notice period where the information is published in common domain, wherever they can stick it on a wall or in the panchayat office or something. And the period of notice varies from 15 days for some states to up to 40 days in some other states. So this notice period is for people to organize their thoughts and to see if there are mistakes that have been made there. And if there are mistakes and they're not prepared to live with them, then they can go back and object, and it goes through the regular process of conflict resolution of objections being raised. So the revenue officer would decide at one level, and then you could do an appeal or something. So all that mechanism is there as it used to be for agricultural land. In fact, some of the states are already talking about having a new legislation in place, like an act devoted just to the Abadi lands all by itself, rather than be the corollary or an adjunct to an already existing act which does not take care of its needs, of the needs of the issue, really. So some states are already talking about that, and this is something that we need to respond to. Of course, we can't tell them that this is your act, but we could suggest that this is something that you could do.
Mm-hmm. And along similar lines as my earlier question, since land titles are disproportionately held by men of privileged castes, what safeguards and redressal mechanisms does the scheme seek to implement to ensure equitable recognition of land titles going forward?
If I were to define equitability in this context as a person being able to get a property card corresponding to their ownership inside the Abadi in a certain village, then we are 100% equitable. If you have land there and you are the neighbor, or you're living in the same Abadi as a very rich guy who's a 1,000 square yard plot or something, then even if you have a 20 square meter plot, you would get your title. I'm saying that I can't do 1,000 plus 20 divided by 2, but the 1,000 thing guy would also get his property title, and the 20 square meter guy would also get his. So that way it is equitable, and it is transparent, it is fair. I am not sure if I've answered your question, because we are not redistributing or something. If the people who moved out of the Abadi, if they're all of a certain, caste or class or something, then of course what Madhya Pradesh has done, this is something that could also be resorted to. If these people have moved out of the Abadi area to within the neighborhood of their existing Abadi area, but then by virtue of being outside that land, and by virtue of being on what is defined as agricultural land now, they do not have access to the amenities that they would like to, then of course the state government has to step in and provide these people. I understand that they would be doing it now in very large numbers and with a great deal of alacrity.
I think what I was trying to say was that, say, often in families, land, if any, is usually passed down only among men of the households. So I was curious about efforts to create equity in land ownership as a part of this process.
I'll tell you that a lot of people shared their photographs of the function that they carried out in their own places. On the 11th, not only did the Prime Minister have a function and an event, but the physical distribution of property cards in all the 763 villages. I got a lot of pictures showing lady recipients of the property card, but that might be rigged, you'll say. So we've also had a look at the beneficiaries, because all these people were also sent SMS messages from which they could click the link, and based on that, they would travel to the state portal and be able to see their own property card just by virtue of their mobile telephone number. That was the only access they needed. So a lot of those people are ladies. One of the persons that the Prime Minister interacted with, Ramrati, she is also a lady, and this is something she said, that just because I'm weak and I'm alone and there's nobody to speak for me, so with this now I have a guarantee that nobody is going to push me out of what is mine by right. I mean, how the ownership changes, how it travels from one generation to generation, whether we are in a patrilineal or a matrilineal system, that is not something that the scheme itself could change. But if there is a woman heir, then the property card would be made out in her name. Or if he's a shareholder, then her name would be reflected in the property card as a regular co-owner. That much is assured.
Uh-huh. So as we approach the end of the interview, a recurring part of our conversation has been about the many stakeholders involved in the scheme, from the State Revenue Department to the Gram Panchayat. I wanted to know about the kind of approach that facilitated and encouraged cooperation.
So this scheme was bigger than everybody. The idea was bigger than every individual, every department, and so I suppose it brought out the good in everyone, and people just cooperated. Also because of the appeal of the scheme, the appeal of the idea. In a lot of states, it is being actively pursued by the chief ministers themselves. I've given you the example of Haryana earlier in my chat, and I know that the chief minister of UP is regularly reviewing this, as are all other people. So when that happens, then the departments fall in line. For those of people who are looking for signals and looking for nudges and all that, so that has happened. And otherwise, this is something that everybody can relate to because it is so universal that the people who are there, they've also come from a village. They've also had a similar kind of situation. They've also had the same challenges. And this is something that they can relate to very easily. So where money and all goes, the scheme is not worth a great deal. For the 100,000 villages that we are covering, it's only 80 crores allocation for the scheme. So it is mainly the idea that is so valuable, and I think everybody is cooperating of their own volition, really.
I like how you put that. People are invested in SVAMITVA partly because of how commonplace property-related disputes are. So, a question that we'd like to ask all our guests is, what will it take to secure land rights for a billion going forward?
Yeah, it'll just take the state governments to act very proactively, to lay out the grounds, to put their legislations in place, to have a Swamitva, because this is also something that the Department of Financial Services had said, that if your property card or title deed or whatever it is, if it is naturally flowing from a certain legislation, if it is like an annexure in this legislation, then it has a great deal of strength. So the quicker the states provide for it, the easier will it be to realize the potential of this card. Not just from the standpoint of an instrument to reduce conflict in villages, but also as a tool to source loans should you want to. And from the Panchayats point of view, a means of being able to generate more resources that you are going to be utilizing locally. It's very difficult for Panchayat elected representatives. I keep going back to Himachal Pradesh. In Himachal, you don't have a lot of people. So if you are working your fields and you don't have, seasonal labor passing by and all who you engage for the purpose of harvest or something, you have to depend on each other. Yeah. So if there is going to be the harvest on somebody's field today, then the people all come together to this guy's field. And the next day, they all move together to the next guy's field. So they are very tightly bound together. And in this context, I suppose that any money that is being accumulated, you cannot have that money getting wasted anywhere because people are there, they marry into each other's families, they have to see each other day in and day out, they have to cooperate for the sake of their existence. So in such a thick thing, I suppose to a lesser or greater degree, the things would be the same in any village. If that is the case, then any property tax that is being recovered using the Swamitva property cards as a basis that tells you what is the size of a property held by a certain person, any property tax that goes or that gets collected in this way has to be well spent because everyone's looking. I mean, you can't run away from this.
Thank you, Mr. Nagar, for joining us on Land of a Billion to share important details about the ambitious Swamitva scheme.
Thank you, Abhishek.
Mr. Nagar's helpful insights about how the Swamitva scheme could reduce property-related disputes has made me all eager to see how the scheme pans out. However, given unequal power structures based on caste and gender, the scheme has the potential to formalize pre-existing inequalities through conferring dominant groups with land titles. It'll be interesting to see how the scheme might move towards offsetting some of these issues. We've got many more episodes on property rights lined up for you, so subscribe to us on your preferred streaming platform so you don't miss out on any. And yes, we'd love to hear from you about this episode, especially since Mr. Nagar shared several new aspects about the scheme in great detail. Do send us your message through Twitter, where PRRC_India, and if you like this episode, please consider sharing it. I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.